the same time, but apparently you all will be able to see both once I get rolling. So let me pull up the presentation. Okay, so welcome everyone to this discussion, and I do want it to be more of a discussion. This is entitled Returning to the Roots, Educating, Equipping, and Empowering Christian Disciples for Social Justice Ministry. And I purposely chose the metaphor of roots. Normally, when we talk about the church, we talk about it either as the house of God or the body of Christ. And although I don't think either one of those metaphors are incorrect or inappropriate in any way, I'd like to think more from an Afrocentric perspective. And I think in order for us to address the issues that we have both internally and externally, I think this metaphor is a lot more useful. So when you think about roots, obviously a lot of things come to mind. It's sort of a symbol of what it means to be part of the African diaspora. We all remember the movie Roots, and Alex Haley chose probably the most appropriate metaphor to talk about our story pre-America and then our sojourn in America. And the power of roots, of course, this metaphor I prefer for a number of reasons. One is it represents strength. In the picture that's on the screen, you see the roots going deep, deep, deep. The roots are actually indispensable. And in many cases, they are stronger than the tree itself. From it, we get the spirit. So in other words, the DNA of the tree is included in its roots. You don't have a tree without roots. So if the roots are cut off in any way, or if they're damaged, the tree is going to be damaged. And that's going to be important for our discussion. The spirit. We also talk about roots being long and sort of incontrollable. They go in different ways in different directions. And that kind of describes, I think, the spirit of Africans across the diaspora, but certainly in the United States. And then substance. Obviously, we get our nourishment. And the substance of who we are is fed through the roots. So if the roots aren't healthy, then the tree is not going to be healthy. So let me begin. Before I go to this slide, let me kind of situate myself. I want to welcome all of you to the discussion. And I'm going to assume that there are some people in the room who either don't know me or I don't know you. So let me talk a little bit about myself and why this discussion is really important. Of course, currently I serve as the president of Clinton College, but I got to Clinton because of my roots and my own journey. So Dr. Zelix, I was definitely moved by your presentation because I'm formerly homeless. In fact, for most of my teenage years, we were homeless. My family struggled with insufficiencies, with housing and food and support services. My mother, right around the time I turned 13, was struggling with issues that I didn't really know about, but tracing my family's history had a lot to do with mental health issues. And she had great dreams, desires, and aspirations for our family, my younger sister and I, but didn't always have a good plan that she could execute to help fulfill that vision. So in fact, when I was 13, my mother decided she wanted to go to college, something that she had never done. And so she enrolled, but didn't really have a plan of how she was going to pay for that, how she was going to manage the household and all those things. She left the job that she had and got on welfare, AFDC. And it started sort of a downward spiral for us. And so we were thrown into the throes of a system that Zelix talked about so brilliantly today that isn't really designed to be the safety net and the support that families need. And then fast forwarding that, I decided that I want to go to college. I graduated from high school, only applied to one college, ended up going to Morehouse, and it totally transformed my life. I should back up a little bit and say that there were three constants in my life before that. They were church, sports, and school. Those three things kind of anchored me. And so grateful for the Belmont Street AME Zion Church, 21 Belmont Street, Worcester, Massachusetts, 01605, that provided the roots for me, right? So it was my grandmama's church who moved to South Carolina, from South Carolina to Worcester, Massachusetts in the 30s, where my mother and her 5 siblings were raised first of all, it was a stable Black community that was dislocated through urban renewal. That's a whole nother conversation around social justice. But I'm a product of that lineage, and there's a whole lot contained in that conversation. Hopefully we'll return to, but those pillars that I had gave me enough foundation to have the intellectual, spiritual, and moral wherewithal to go to a historically Black college. And I could say a whole lot right there, but that provided the foundation. And interestingly, to make a contemporary connection, while I was a student at Morehouse, I happened to have been invited to a Thanksgiving dinner with then Councilman John Lewis. He and his wife had a practice of bringing college students into their homes for obvious reasons. When you know his story, it makes a whole lot of sense. And he was getting ready to launch a campaign for Congress. This is 1985, and he ran to be elected in 1986. And I became an intern in his office. So, of course, I'm now immersed and baptized in a movement, because being connected to John Lewis, you then become exposed to something that's much bigger than you. And so that kind of helped to form and shape my understanding of the church's role and African Americans' role in social justice. And so my entire career has been evolving around social justice. I have a couple of wonderful personal experiences that I can share with you, pivotal periods around social justice. If we have time, we'll come back to them. But let's talk about the roots of the Black church. So I've identified at least 3, there are more, but these are 3 major roots that I think are necessary for the tree to be strong and for the branches to point in the direction of liberation and social justice. They are cultural. So we have to understand ourselves as Africans. And I do believe that one of our main problems as a community, one of the challenges, if you will, it's not insurmountable, it's not something that we can't overcome, but this lack of real cultural understanding, not just appropriation, but embracing and enculturation of what it means to be an African. To be an African is to live almost in contradistinction to the Western Empire, right? So imperialism and colonization, and those of you that heard Dr. Miguel de la Torre this morning, you got a brilliant presentation of what colonization does, what the empire does to people. And Africans might be, of course, where, I'm ethnocentric. I'm going to talk about it from an African perspective, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find another people who could have withstood the Ma'afa, the great suffering that we went through during the Middle Passage and beyond. But I do believe what enabled us to endure was our African roots, our sense of self and community, that an African does not see him or herself as an isolated individual. I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. It is that worldview that enabled us to go through, where we preferred each other, we preferred and protected our children. We sacrificed, we even gave up our own lives so that our children could live. In some instances, there were mothers that threw their children overboard on a slave ship because they didn't want their children to have to experience the horrors, the brutality of slavery. There are all kinds of things that I think inform who we are as a people, whether we're conscious of it or not. Theologically, this is another conversation, but I was really appreciative of Miguel de la Torre's discussion of the theology of colonization and the theology of resistance. Africans were able to develop a whole new religion that incorporated African traditional religions in the context of white evangelical theology, right? And then, of course, the communal is connected to both. Our understanding of family, we automatically call each other brother and sister. It has less to do with religion. You know, in the church, we use brother and sister, but has more to do with our sense of kinship, that we all are related. We in the 70s, we started using the term blood. What's up, blood? That was our way of saying that we are connected. We're connected by DNA, but also spiritually, we are connected. So for us, if we understand the roots, this is the strength of us as a people, us as a church, as a community. But you know, I'm not good at gardening, but there's some simple things that you understand about gardening and planting and cultivating, and you know that if the soil isn't right and if the roots are damaged, then nothing will grow. The plant, the tree will not be healthy. And I think over time, we've had some damaging of our roots. And I list 4 things here that are sure to kill a tree. If it is diseased, and sometimes this is infestation of pests that can infiltrate the roots. And we can talk about that from a historical and a political and an economic and a spiritual way. Our roots have been diseased. Our roots have been disconnected. Obviously, if there's a break in the roots, the likelihood of the tree being able to survive and thrive becomes less. If they are disassembled in any way, this is how I think the architects of colonization recognized if they could separate us from one another, then we would not feel the strength and know the strength of community and of family. And then the other part is dismembered, literally cutting off. And of course, you could use this metaphor for the body of Christ, right? That if we are dismembered in any way, that lessens our ability to. It doesn't mean that we can't survive. It doesn't mean that we can't live. It doesn't mean that we can't perform. But if you are dismembered, you become disabled, and you have to fight that much harder. So what does this have to do with talking about social justice ministry? Well, the ways that these things happen are through amnesia, right? So if we are led to somehow adopt a story that's not true, that's a form of amnesia. So that has to do with us as Africans somehow believing that we're inferior, believing that we didn't have a religion or didn't have a sense of self or didn't have the whole number of things that the lie tells us. And when we begin to adopt that, we begin to live with amnesia, a literal forgetting. And this happens to people over time. You forget what happens. You forget what happened to you. You forget who you are. You forget your purpose and your mission. And so churches, if we're going to do social justice ministry, if we're going to rethink church, we're going to have to deal with the wholesale amnesia that has infected the church. There's another term that I love called anamnesis. Anamnesis is actually the opposite of amnesia. It is literally to remember. So what we've got to do is remember our story. We've got to be able to tell who we are, going back to our African civilization, all through our history in the Western world, to tell the story of how African Americans were able to overcome, how we were able to achieve, to overcome the odds and the obstacles. Anamnesis is to tell the positive story of where we are. So I've developed a concept that I call standing on holy common ground. In fact, I hope you all can see my book, Standing on Holy Common Ground, and where I talk about how the church can recapture this mission by being reconciled to ourselves, right? One of the reasons our communities are struggling and are in a sense disintegrating is because there's a disconnect from our roots, our religious and our spiritual, our cultural, our historic roots. And so the African American church has some work to do. There is animosity between Black churches and Black communities. We don't like to talk about it, but it's getting worse. I mean, there are literally people who are atheistic by default, right? They don't believe God and don't believe in the power of the church because we have not shared our true story and we have not shared the space that we once occupied together. So we've got to remember, we've got to reconcile, we've got to repair, and we've got to restore. So here again, my contention is that there are two major ruptures. There are probably more, but two major ruptures that need to be repaired and restored. One has to do with the Black church and Black theology. We and De La Torre hinted at this earlier. One of the things that has hurt us is we got trained. You know, what happened is we got education. We founded some Black colleges. Most of them were started in the church, by the church, for the church. And we got education. Then we started going to seminaries. And the problem is that we began to adopt wholesale white evangelical theology, which is part and parcel of empire. It is connected to white supremacy and white privilege. It enforces, ensconces, protects, and privileges a theology of oppression. So we have preachers who are preaching a gospel, whether it is in word, as De La Torre said, you know, you can preach without preaching. So it's more akin to the practices and policies and polities of our churches that privilege some people over others. So that has been a problem. And James Cone, who is the father of Black theology, hit it on the head, was able to develop a whole systemic theology, if you will, that was grounded in praxis and based on the genius of the Black church. Gave us a language and a way to talk about who we are, to talk about our identity and our mission to the oppressed. So there is a need, and I should say that there's a chasm. There has been and there continues to be a chasm between Black church and Black theology. There are Black preachers that were staunch critics of James Cone, and vice versa. James Cone was a staunch critic of the Black church. And of course, he was right in many ways, but we couldn't find a way to bridge the gap. And I think right until the end, Dr. Cone was trying to find a way to reconcile Black theology with the Black church. And then, of course, as I hinted at earlier, there's a rupture between the Black church and the African American community, which is something we have to be aware of before we start trying to do social justice ministry, in the same way that Zelix described what's going on in the homeless community and how churches in many ways have become enemies. Some of it is ignorance. Some of it is apathy. Some of it is neglect. The same thing could be said to the myriad of social problems that African-American communities are facing. I often ruffle feathers when I ask the question, when I do workshops with churches in this moment, do Black lives matter to the Black church? Some of us have checked out because preachers ain't leading the movement. When they say this is not your grandmother's movement, I bristle at that, but I get it. In some ways, they're saying we're not adopting a model that has to have a preacher or someone with a Messiah complex, one sole leader up front. The genius of this movement is that they recognize that if you have one head, all you have to do is decapitate the head and you kill the movement. The reason this movement has grown exponentially is because it doesn't have one head leader. The other problem that people have with Black Lives Matter is that it was founded, so to speak, by 3 women, a couple of them that identify as queer or bisexual, and African Americans, especially church folk, have all kinds of hangups. That's a whole nother discussion, but it is related to social justice ministry. Like, we have to decide if we're going to be down for all people or just for some people. So there's the discussion around amnesia that I mentioned earlier. There's apathy, where we just have not been concerned. Thank God for this new tide, this new swelling movement that has happened. And I've talked to people from all circles of all generations, especially the older generation, that has agreed that we've never seen anything quite like this movement. But it would be a shame if we went back to business as usual over time, because we did not, as a church, we did not insert ourselves in a genuine way, an authentic way, with indigenous leadership in this movement. And then the question of anemia, the powerlessness of the church because of the issues I raised earlier around the dismemberment and the disconnection and the disease that has infected the Black church. We've got to overcome all of that. So I want to talk about it. I'm going to kind of pull together this discussion around a couple of biblical texts. And then I want to open it up for discussion. I want to leave, at least 15 minutes for some Q&A. So one of the texts that I use is the Ezekiel 37 text, right? Which is very powerful when you think about doing, and I think if you're going to do social ministry in the church, it needs to be grounded in scripture. You need to exegete your context. And part of the reason that churches are out of the game is because we have adopted a hermeneutic that doesn't speak to the moment, right? You've got to embrace a hermeneutic around justice that will allow you to speak with power. After 9/11, we adopted this phrase, if you see something, say something. Well, if you don't see anything, you don't have anything to say. So if you don't have the proper socio-political analysis to deal with what's going on today, then it's very unlikely that you will be able to effect real change. You could be satisfied with having a soup kitchen ministry. And I don't disparage it, because I pastored churches that had a soup kitchen ministry, and I'm proud of the work that they did. But why do we need a soup kitchen ministry in a country that has obscene wealth? You got to start asking the question, why is it that there are hungry people? Why are there homeless people? Why are there people lacking anything in the richest nation in the world? You got to deal with what capitalism has done. So you got to deal with that. So when you look at the Ezekiel 37 text, right, Ezekiel placed in the middle of the valley of dry bones, it it looks one-dimensional, but you have to understand the context. Ezekiel, and first of all, you got to have a pastoral view, right? Ezekiel looks as a pastor in this valley, and God puts him there. Remember now, God put him in the valley of dry bones because God wanted to sensitize Ezekiel to the conditions of his people. And part of our problem is we've become desensitized to the pain and the predicament that our people are in. You have to pay attention. Don't just go to the church. Obviously, in COVID-19, we're not going to the buildings like we once did, but use your sanctified imagination and think about how cities have now been structured in a way that folks who have privilege never have to see the pain of the people who are underprivileged, right? We built streets, we built highways and throughways where you don't even have to see it now. But when you roll up on most of our churches now, you cannot not see what's going on. But we choose to not see the dearth and the blight of our communities. And, you know, we get out of our fine cars, we suck our teeth, we shake our head, and we go into our wonderful churches behind beautiful stained glass windows with air conditioning. And we're not ever challenged in the service. We're not challenged about the conditions that are around us. And then, or, you know, we might do some social service. So we may have a soup kitchen, we may have a clothes giveaway or food giveaway, but we're never really dealing with the conditions that have brought this on. Right. So part of placing Ezekiel in the valley is to force him to ask some questions. How did these bones get here? What were they like before they died? What were the conditions that caused them to be disassembled in this way? How did they get to be so dry? Right? There are questions that the church ought to be asking, and we ought to ask them in creative ways. I mean, preachers need to paint a picture that helps people see the pain of the predicament, you know? And then the next part is Ezekiel asks God some questions, and God throws back some questions to him. Like, can these bones live? In other words, is there still some potential in them? And if there is, what can we do about it? So I talk about this as the priestly call of the church. The priestly call has to do with ministering to the needs of people, right? To have rituals of healing, rituals of community building, rituals of affirmation. You know, you gotta speak to the bones. You gotta love the bones. You gotta believe in the bones, right? And then finally, the prophetic is to restate the solution. God says to Ezekiel, preach. And after you get done preaching, preach some more. And after you get done preaching some more, speak to the wind, right? Speak to the power of the Holy Spirit to change this situation. In a sense, I think our churches have to be more prophetic. We've said it before, but we've got to say it again, that God is on our side, that we serve the God of the oppressed, as James Cone called God, that God privileges the poor and the oppressed. And we've got to preach that kind of power to ourselves, but certainly to the people who need to hear it most. So you could develop a social justice ministry just around Ezekiel 37, you know, doing a real Bible study and dealing what's going on, what's really going on in this situation. And are we living in a world of dry bones, especially after COVID-19? I mean, I think this text is perfect in the midst of the devastation that we have seen brought on by COVID-19. We are literally living in valleys of dry bones. They are all around us. We cannot escape them, but we've got to be able to preach power to the powerless. So then the next one, I want to wrap up on this one, is overcoming the empire. And again, De La Torre's presentation today was just phenomenal. Many of you all are familiar with Walter Wink, who talks about the powers. He actually has a trilogy that I encourage you to get, Walter Wink, and it's spelled just like it sounds, W-I-N-K. He has a trilogy on naming the powers, unmasking the powers, and engaging the powers. Now, those of you who love Jesus cannot be a follower and a disciple of Christ without fully embracing his prophetic ministry of overcoming the powers, overcoming the empire. When white evangelicals deride and try to dismiss social justice ministry, what they are saying is that we have chosen to use the Bible for a tool of oppression, totally ignoring what Jesus died for. I don't think you can make it any simpler than that. This is what Jesus came for. This is what Jesus fought against. This is what Jesus died for. He came to confront the empire, the powers that be. So if you read, and we don't have enough time to really deal with this right now, because I do want to give you a chance for Q&A, but if you read Luke 4, just read it when you get a chance. The first verses, now I've chosen Luke 4 to kind of be my personal mission statement, right? I believe that when Jesus preached his trial sermon, it was in the context of Luke 4, and the words that he used told you what he came for. So read Luke 4 in your Bible study this week. But the beginning of the chapter is his confrontation with Satan, right? He gets placed in the wilderness, the great temptation. We all know it well. My beloved brother, Raphael Warnock, did a sermon once that really gripped me, dealing with that temptation story. And he talks about, first of all, Jesus had to resist the narrow impulse to self-service. You remember the temptations that Satan gave him, first of all, is make bread. You're hungry. Why don't you make some bread for yourself? The temptation was to serve himself. And this is what empire does. This is what the Western individualistic competitive mentality does to us. Make enough bread for yourself so you can survive. He also, Brother Warnock says, resist the narcissistic impulse to self-aggrandizement. He could have gloried himself. He says to Jesus, you can make yourself greater right now. You could do it. And Jesus says to him, get behind me, Satan. And Dr. Warnock also says, resist the nonsensical impulse to self-destruction. You remember Satan says to Jesus, taking him to the top of the temple, he says, you can just cast yourself down and God will send angels to come and get you. If you're nonsensical, you'll do this. You'll think that you are a Messiah. You will feel like you are all powerful and you can do all of these things. So it was after Jesus overcame this temptation that he went where? To church. He went to the temple. After he had overcome those powers, he had to go deal with another set of powers. Oh my God, I wish I had time to really deal with this. But in this text, he calls out my favorite text, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. That's it right there. So I want to also say to you, I situated myself and I'm still growing. I'm still evolving. I'm working right now on another doctorate. I'm in a PhD program with a focus on Martin Luther King studies. And I'm getting close to writing my dissertation. And my focus is on the Martin Luther King that most folk don't know about. The Martin Luther King that's been forgotten through social amnesia, right? King died fighting against the ultimate powers of racism, militarism, and capitalism. I think that Dr. King had a temptations moment. I think he went through this wrestling where he came to the realization that the real powers, these real powers of racism, militarism, capitalism, are what have to be overthrown. And so he spent his last years on the Poor People's Campaign, right? Dealing with economic justice, dealing with, although he didn't come all the way out, I think if he lived, he would have gotten there. He would have talked about reparations, right? He hinted at reparations, even his message at the March on Washington, when he said, "We've come here to cash a check." That's the part of the speech folk don't want you to listen to. They want you to hear him, for little children not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of the character, when we'll all sit together at the table of brotherhood. They want you to hear that part of the speech, but they don't want you to hear the beginning of the speech where Dr. King says, America has given Black folk a bad check, a check that has been marked insufficient funds, right? That's the kind of social justice ministry that our churches have to begin dealing with. And Black Lives Matters and the Poor People's Campaign, now being led by Bishop William Barber, are beginning to deal with these issues. So all of us that want to have a kumbaya moment with white folks are missing the point. Now, I'm not saying that we can't reconcile with white people, but we got to hold them to account first. That's what we got to deal with. So you have in front of you the 4 points. I don't have time to deal with all of them. If I were preaching, this would be a good text about dealing with the powers. But again, this is material for you. And I want to encourage you to get my book, Standing on Holy Common Ground, where you can begin to explore much of this material. Social justice ministry for the church. I think you have to make it a mandate. In other words, you need to require it. It's not an either or. It's not an appendage. It's not an afterthought. Social justice ought to be central to your church's ministry if you're following Jesus, because that's what Jesus was about. Now, if you want to have some other kinds of ministries, some other auxiliaries, that's fine. I mean, I think there's a social aspect of the church. But if you're going to deal with liberation, which Jesus died for, you got to deal with it in a real way. So you got to make it a mandate. In other words, you got to require it. You ought to make it a ministry of the church, which means you need to staff it, whether it is volunteer or paid. I've had in a couple of churches a minister of social justice. And you need to make it a mission, which means you need to fund it. You need to put it in your budget. You're not going to do very much with ministries that you're not investing in. And it tells what your priorities are by where you put your money. So I'm gonna stop there, and let me see if I can come back. All right. So I want to stop there and give you a chance to ask questions or just give some reflections and feedback. I apologize for using more of the time than I planned, because I want to have more time for us to discuss. But let me open it up now. I'm going to try to see if I can field some questions here, if there are any. Thank you all for your comments. Okay. All right. So while you're still thinking about specific questions, here's one, Reverend Brown. How do we get the Black church to unlearn slaveholder theology? It's a process, right? Which is why I said it's important for us to affirm who we are, right? The more you understand yourself, the more you recognize how colonized you've been, right? And that's what colonization does. It gets you to adopt someone else's mode of superiority. One of the things that Black folks lament often, and you hear our ancestors, our elders, I should say, talk about this, that we lost a lot in integration. And I happen to agree with them. I don't think integration was all bad, but integration became assimilation. So to Reverend Brown's point, when you adopt the slaveholder theology, you want to be like the slave holder. You want to be like the slaveholder, right? You want to have the power to dominate, to dictate, to control. You want to make someone else feel inferior in order for you to feel superior, right? It's what we do. So assimilation is dangerous. And I think we're now in a moment, we've had a couple of these moments in our history where we've had an awakening, where we finally recognized that white ice was not colder than black ice, that there's actually been damage done, that white supremacy is institutionalized and systematized in such a way that you cannot avoid it. It's all around you. So you have to develop the power of resistance to empire, which is a philosophy and a practice, right? So we've got to empower our people to be true disciples of Jesus Christ and understand what he fought for and what he died for. What would be some of the beginning steps of a church starting a social justice ministry? Good question, Reverend Kyles. So I think having some Bible studies. Actually, when I did my D-Min, I used Pennsylvania Avenue, I mean that in a positive way, as my laboratory, right? Pennsylvania Avenue Church sits in the west side of Baltimore on a major thoroughfare. Of course, many of you all watched what happened with Freddie Gray and the Black Lives Matter protests that came to Baltimore. Pennsylvania Avenue Church is blocks away from the epicenter of that movement, Penn and North, Pennsylvania Avenue and North Avenue, right? So, when you look at the history of Baltimore, like many urban centers that were systematically disinvested, it led to a breakdown in several different areas, right? And so we're seeing poverty and its impact on community on a daily basis. So we began to have some Bible studies. I did a whole preaching series and Bible study series on how we, as I gave you the pastoral piece in the Ezekiel text, how we review our setting, how we look at what's around us, and begin to talk about how did we get here and how can we move. I think social justice ministries in churches need to do that. You need to have these honest discussions that don't stop with woe is me, but they actually lead to the power we have to change this situation. Reverend Hobson, would you speak what seems to be discomfort within the Black church to embrace Black theology and an anti-racist liberationist position and practices that challenge and transform the church, communities, policies, etc.? Yeah, great question. I think, again, it deals with our inability to disassociate ourselves with quite frankly, the white evangelical theology that has been given to us that we somehow think is superior to Black theology. Black theology at its core critiques white theology. It begins to challenge the white church, and some of us, quite frankly, are uncomfortable. You think white folks are uncomfortable with us challenging them. Black folks are just as uncomfortable. We start squirming. We have been conditioned to be polite and forgiving and apologetic about white supremacy. It's crazy, but that's what's happened to us. So because we have discomfort with this, we don't want to embrace Black theology. It is, yes, someone talked about the cognitive dissonance. That's really what's happening. There's this disconnect between affirming ourselves and challenging the systems, right? We can do one or the other, but we can't do both. Right? It's crazy. But I think this is where churches can be the mediating structures to make this possible, for us to have a place where we can understand ourselves and understand the systems and understand what needs to be done to change these systems. All right, we're right at 1:15. So Quinta, do we have a hard stop now, or do we have opportunities for any other questions? You're welcome, Pastor Hobson. Okay, Quinta said I can take one more question. Reverend Kyles, you talked about our African culture and values, our roots. We used to be blood and make sacrifices. How can we get back to that? I don't think it's hard. I mean, I think it really is just a reminder and a refresher because it's in us. If you grew up in the Black church or attended a Black church, you have been baptized, so to speak, in Africanness, whether it was explicit or implicit. Most Black churches are African to the core. Our expressions, call and response, praise dance, we finally were able to take off the shackles in churches. The first was when we let drums come into church. Some of y'all are old enough to remember the fight we had to have drums in the church, right? Then we went to liturgical dance. We had to make it, kind of palatable to bourgeois sensibilities of middle class Negroes, and we called it liturgical dance. Well, I mean, it was allowing us to express ourselves with our whole selves, right? So I think there are things that are happening stylistically and substantively that are drawing us back to our Africanness, our African roots. I think we can be more intentional about partnering with our brothers and sisters across the diaspora. We can be doing more of that. Obviously, as an AME Zion Church, it's in our name, right? We are the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. I know that there are people of other denominations on here, but I'll never forget when I went to Morehouse as an 18-year-old freshman, I met the dean of the chapel who became my mentor, Dean Carter. Asked, as he did all students, what's your name? Where are you from? What denomination are you? And I said, AME Zion. And he said to me, I am so proud and grateful that your church did not take the name African out of its name. I had never thought about, I had taken it for granted, but that was an awakening for me to say my denomination, first of all, chose to put African in its name and held on to it. Now, we may not always live that out in a right way, but we're doing better in understanding who we are as an African American church. So I think those are ways, Reverend Kyles, that we can get back to understanding who we are and using that as our strength, our anchor, our platform for true social justice ministries.